The dare started as a joke and ended the night Claire Weston's entire life shifted off its axis without making a single sound. She had not planned to be at the Meridian that Thursday evening. She had planned to grade a stack of sophomore watercolor assignments, eat leftover pasta, and be in bed before 11. But Renata had texted at 6:30 with that particular brand of urgency that only existed when she had already made a reservation and simply needed bodies to fill it. "Claire, come out. You haven't left your apartment for 11 days, except to buy coffee and more watercolor paper. That is not a life. That is a studio with a kitchen." So Claire had come. The Meridian was a jazz bar on the north side of Chicago that existed in the space between expensive and pretentious, managing to be neither while being entirely both. The lighting was amber and low. A quartet played something unhurried in the corner. The crowd was a mix of business people unwinding and couples finding reasons to stay close. Claire sat at the booth with Renata and her colleague Deb, nursing a glass of white wine, and feeling, as she often did in social settings, pleasantly invisible. She was 31 years old, 5'6". With dark auburn hair she kept in a loose twist when she wasn't in front of a classroom. She wore a gray wrap dress that Renata had once called elegant without trying, and she had accepted the compliment at face value. She was not the kind of woman men noticed from across rooms. She was the kind of woman they noticed only after talking to her for 20 minutes. And usually only then, because she had said something that surprised them. That was fine with Claire. She preferred to control the terms of being seen. The dare began, as most dares in bars do, with boredom and wine and someone pointing. Renata leaned across the table with her eyebrows raised, and a grin that was never a good sign. "See the man at the bar?" Claire didn't look right away. She already knew the kind of man Renata pointed at in bars. She looked anyway. He sat at the far end of the mahogany counter on a stool that looked too small for him, though he used it with absolute ease. He was facing away at a slight angle, enough for Claire to see his profile. Broad, sharp. Still in a way that felt different from relaxed. He wore a black suit that fit him the way suits in films fit actors, meaning it had been made to fit him specifically and no one else. His hair was platinum blonde, pushed back from his face with effortless precision. His hands rested on the counter, and even from 30 feet away, Claire could see the rings on his fingers catching the bar light. He wasn't talking to anyone. He had a glass in front of him that he hadn't touched in at least 10 minutes. He was simply there, in the way that walls are simply there, permanent and structural and not to be moved. "I dare you," Renata said, "to go kiss him." Deb choked on her drink. Claire turned back to the table. "Absolutely not." Renata leaned further. "A real kiss. 3 seconds minimum." Claire shook her head. "He looks like someone who has people arrested." Renata grinned wider. "That's why it's a dare, and not a suggestion." Claire looked at the man again. Something about his stillness made her feel like he already knew everything happening in the room without needing to look at any of it. That should have made her decision easy. It made it complicated instead, because Claire Weston had one particular flaw she had never fully managed to correct. She was genuinely and helplessly curious. She finished her wine in 2 long swallows. Deb stared. Renata started quiet clapping. "Don't make a scene," Claire told her, already sliding out of the booth. She walked toward the bar with the specific pace of someone who had a destination, and not a dare. She kept her shoulders back. She kept her expression neutral. The man didn't turn as she approached, but something in his posture changed by a single, subtle degree, the way a room changes when a window opens, not dramatically. Just a shift in pressure. Claire stopped beside him, close enough that he would have to acknowledge her or actively choose not to. He chose not to at first. He lifted his glass, finally, and took a slow drink, his eyes remaining forward on the mirror of bottles behind the bar. Claire could see his face now in full, and it was precisely the kind of face that made people careful. Jaw like something architectural. a small scar along the left cheekbone, thin and healed silver, eyes that caught the light and held it without warmth. He was not handsome in the way of men who smiled easily. He was handsome in the way of things that could hurt you if you touched them wrong. "Hi?" Claire said. He looked at her then. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately, the way someone looks when they are deciding what category to file you under. Claire didn't give herself time to rethink it. She leaned in, put one hand very lightly on the edge of the bar for balance, and kissed him. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. His mouth was still and cool at first, neither welcoming nor refusing. By the second second, it was neither of those things. By the third, Claire pulled back and straightened, keeping her expression even through sheer will. She waited for annoyance. She waited for amusement. She waited for the kind of dismissive laugh that would let her walk back to the table with the dare completed, and her dignity mostly intact. He looked at her in absolute silence. His eyes were ice blue, and they did not laugh, and they did not dismiss. They simply held her there, still and precise, like a pin through a specimen. "You made a mistake," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind that didn't need to rise to fill a room. Claire's pulse spiked once, then steadied. She lifted her chin slightly. "It was a dare," she said. His eyes moved over her face with a slowness that felt like measurement rather than interest. "Who sent you?" Claire blinked. "What?" He set his glass down. The movement was controlled and quiet, and it made the air feel smaller. His gaze didn't move from hers. "No one," Claire said, feeling the absurdity of the situation crystallize. It was a stupid dare. "My friends at that booth." She glanced back. Renata was partially hidden behind a menu with only her forehead visible. Very helpful. The man looked at the booth for 2 seconds, then back to Claire. His expression hadn't changed. He reached into his jacket pocket with 2 fingers and set something on the bar between them. A business card, matte black, with only a name and number in silver ink. Antoni Malloy. "Go back to your booth," he said. "Don't leave the building for 20 minutes. Claire stared at the card. "That's not how dares work," she said, and immediately wasn't sure why she'd said it. The edge of his mouth moved, not a smile. Something more like the acknowledgement that a smile could theoretically exist in this face under different circumstances. "Go," he said. Claire went. She walked back to the booth with her spine straight and set the card face down on the table. Renata immediately flipped it over. "Oh," Renata said. "Oh." Claire poured herself more wine. Deb read the card twice. "Should we leave?" she asked. "The man said not to for 20 minutes, Claire said. Renata looked at the bar. "He's already gone." They all looked. The stool was empty. The glass was still there, half full, as if he'd simply dematerialized. "That was faster than 20 minutes, Deb said quietly. Claire looked at the card, then at the empty bar stool, then at her wine. Something in her chest felt like the moment before a weather change, that particular atmospheric pressure that means the air itself has decided to do something. She couldn't name it precisely. She picked up the card and slid it into the outer pocket of her bag, meaning to throw it away later, meaning to forget it entirely, meaning to make tonight a story she told at dinner parties in 10 years about the time she kissed a stranger in a jazz bar and survived. She was already composing the version that was funny. She had no way of knowing that 22 blocks north, in a building with no name on the exterior, a man with platinum blonde hair was standing at a window with his phone to his ear, speaking 4 words that were not loud and not hurried, but landed like stones dropped in water. "Find out who she is." Morning came gray and quiet over Claire's neighborhood. She had slept poorly, not from anxiety, because she didn't feel anxious, but from the particular restlessness that comes after a night that doesn't resolve properly, a night that ends on a suspended cord instead of a resolution. She made coffee. She graded the watercolor assignments. She wrote comments in the margins in her careful looping hand. Maya, your color instinct is excellent. Your confidence needs to match it. She ate toast without tasting it. She told herself the card in her bag was nothing. She told herself that mysterious men in bars were mysterious in the way of movies and not in the way of real life, and that real life had a way of being entirely boring in the follow-through. Then someone knocked on her door at 8:47 in the morning. Claire was still in her robe. She looked through the peephole and saw a man she didn't recognize in a gray suit, standing with his hands clasped in front of him in the universal posture of someone who is paid to be patient. She opened the door with the chain still on. Yes, he was in his 40s, clean-cut, entirely unremarkable, except for the way he held himself, which was the way of a person who had spent a great deal of time in rooms where things were decided and had learned to take up exactly the space required, and no more. "Miss Weston," he said. She felt a cold thread move through her chest. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" He reached into his jacket and produced a card, holding it through the gap. She didn't take it. On it was the same silver-on-black design as the card from the previous night. Different number. Same font. "He would like to meet you," the man said. "Antony Malloy." Claire stared at the card. "He knows my name," she said. "He knows your address," the man said calmly, as if that were a lesser detail. That was when Claire felt the first genuine thread of fear move through the curiosity that had been carrying her since last night. She thought about closing the door. She thought about calling Renata. She thought about the look on Antony Malloy's face in the bar. Not the face of a man who was interested in her, but the face of a man who was solving something, and she had been the variable introduced without permission. "I don't understand what he wants," Claire said. The man in gray looked at her with the particular patience of someone who has answered this kind of question before and found it irrelevant. "He would prefer to explain that himself," he said. Claire looked at the card in the gap of the door. She thought about the word mistake. She thought about who sent you. She thought about the way the bar stool had been empty so quickly, as if he had already been moving before she reached her table. "I'm not going anywhere with someone I don't know," she said. He nodded as if this were reasonable and expected. "Then I will ask you to please not leave your building today," he said, "unless it becomes necessary for us to relocate you for your own safety." The words landed like something dropped from a height. Claire felt the chain on the door between her fingers and was suddenly very aware of how thin it was. "For my own safety," she repeated. He looked at her steadily. "Last night was complicated, Miss Weston." He turned and walked down the hallway without another word. Claire closed the door. She stood in her kitchen with her coffee going cold and her pulse doing something uneven, and considered the exact sequence of decisions that had led her here. She picked up her phone and called Renata. "Someone just came to my apartment," she said when Renata answered. "Because of last night?" Renata's voice was immediately alert, in a way that meant she already knew this had weight. "Yes." "Oh, Claire." Claire looked at her bag on the counter, the black card still in the outer pocket. "I think I need you to tell me everything you know about a man named Antony Malloy." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Renata, who had grown up in Chicago, who had worked in city government for 9 years, and heard things in corridors that she never repeated at dinner parties, was quiet for 4 full seconds before she said, "Claire, don't go anywhere. I'll be there in 20 minutes." And in that pause, in those 4 seconds, Claire understood that the thing in her chest she had been calling curiosity had shifted into something with more weight and sharper edges. She picked up her bag to set it on the chair and felt it. A slight unevenness at the bottom, a rigidity that hadn't been there when she'd packed it. Her hands slowed. She set the bag down carefully on the kitchen table and opened it. Her things were exactly as she'd left them: keys, wallet, sketchbook, the black card. But at the very bottom, tucked flat beneath the interior lining that had come slightly unstitched. She felt the edge of something that did not belong. She worked 2 fingers under the lining and drew it out slowly. An envelope, sealed, white. No name, no address. Just a small stamp in the lower corner, a symbol she didn't recognize, a kind of crest or seal pressed in dark ink. Claire set it on the table. She did not open it. She looked at it the way she looked at things she was painting, from slightly too far away, trying to understand its dimensions before committing to its shape. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered without meaning to. "Miss Weston," said the voice of Antony Malloy, low and controlled and exactly as she remembered it from the bar. "Don't open the envelope." Claire's breath stopped. Her eyes went to the sealed flap. She had not opened it. "I wasn't going to," she said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "I don't even know what it is." There was a silence on the line. She could not read it. "Where did you get it?" he said. It was not a question. It was the voice of a man who already had a theory and was deciding how much of it to show her. "My bag," she said. "It was in my bag. I don't know how." Another silence. This one longer. When he spoke again, his voice was the same temperature as before, which was the absence of warmth rather than the presence of cold. "I'll come to you," he said. "Do not touch it again. Stay where you are." The call ended. Claire set the phone down. She looked at the envelope. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. Traffic, a delivery truck reversing, someone's radio drifting up from a lower floor. Inside her kitchen, everything was entirely still. She thought, "I graded papers this morning. I had coffee. I wore a robe." She thought, "How does a sealed envelope get inside the lining of a bag I carried into a jazz bar for one evening, and then brought home and set on my counter?" She thought about Antony Malloy's first words to her in the bar. "You made a mistake." She understood now that he had not been talking about the dare. He arrived in 40 minutes. No gray-suited man this time. He came himself, which Claire understood only later was not the way it usually worked, and was a significant departure from his standard procedures. She had dressed. She had also, because she was a person who did things with intention, set the envelope exactly where she'd found it, and placed her sketchbook on the table with a pencil beside it, because sketching was how she thought when she didn't know what else to do with her hands. She had not called Renata back. She would deal with that later. When the knock came, it was 3 measured sounds, not loud, not hesitant, carrying a specific authority. She opened the door, and Antony Malloy was standing in her hallway in a different suit from the night before. This one charcoal, equally perfect. In daylight, outside the amber light of the bar, he was exactly as she remembered, which was surprising. She had expected him to be smaller in ordinary light. He was not. His eyes moved past her into the apartment in a single, comprehensive sweep before landing on her face. He came in when she stepped back. He didn't look around the way people did when entering a new space out of curiosity. He looked around the way people did when they were cataloging exits. He saw the envelope on the table. He crossed to it, crouched, looked at it without touching it. He stayed that way for a moment that felt longer than it was. Something working in the set of his jaw that Claire couldn't name. Then he straightened. He turned to her, and she was struck again by the quality of his stillness, the way his body existed in space with such deliberate economy, no wasted movement, no unconscious fidget. "It's real," he said quietly. Claire crossed her arms. "Would you like to tell me what it is?" He looked at her. His expression was controlled in a way she recognized from the bar. Not blank exactly, but managed. Every visible reaction a choice rather than a reflex. "Do you know who I am?" he said. "I know your name," she said. "I know you know where I live. I know that the man you sent to my door this morning said I might need to be relocated for my own safety, which is the most alarming phrase I've heard in my entire life." She paused. And I know you think I did something on purpose last night." His gaze didn't move. "Did you?" "No," she said. He studied her face with the same measuring quality she'd felt at the bar. That slow and precise attention that felt like being read rather than seen. She held it. She'd spent 11 years in front of teenagers who tested things, and she had learned not to break eye contact first when it mattered. "You teach art," he said. It wasn't a question. "Middle school," she said. 7th and 8th grade, at Lakeview Academy. The fact that he knew this should have frightened her more than it did. What he said next did. "Someone placed that envelope in your bag last night," he said, "because they knew you would come close to me." His voice was entirely level. Claire felt the sentence land with the slow weight of something heavy. "What's in it?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were in his pockets. His rings were absent today, which struck her as intentional. "Evidence," he said quietly. "The kind that ends careers. Or lives." Claire's mouth went dry. He said, "Someone is trying to use you to reach me." Claire stared at the envelope on the table. "I don't know anyone in your world," she said. "At all. I'm a teacher. I live alone. I grade watercolor assignments and go to bed before 11. And last night was the first time I have gone out in 11 days. He watched her. The quality of his attention shifted by a degree she couldn't name. "You think I'm lying," she said. He said, "I think I don't know yet." She said, "That's honest." He almost said something that might have been agreement. Instead, he moved to the window and looked at the street below, standing to the side of the frame in a way that meant he could see out without being visible from below. That also struck her as intentional and deeply habitual. "Who chose the bar?" he said. "My friend Renata." He nodded once. "I'll need her full name." Claire's jaw tightened. "She's not involved in anything." He turned from the window. "Miss Weston," she said. "Claire." A pause. He processed that. "Claire." His voice was the same, low and contained, but her name in it had a particular weight she filed away without meaning to. "I'm not suggesting your friend knew anything. I'm asking because I need to trace the chain." She understood the distinction. She gave him Renata's last name. He typed it into his phone with one hand, quickly, then set the phone away. He looked at the apartment again, not the cataloging look this time. He looked at her bookshelf, her drafting table in the corner, the 3 small canvases drying on a wooden rack by the window, abstracts in muted blue and ochre. His gaze settled on them for a moment. She watched him look. He seemed aware of being watched. He turned back to her. "I need you to come with me," he said. "No," she said immediately. He looked at her without surprise. "If the people who put that envelope in your bag realize it hasn't been delivered," he said, "they will assume it was intercepted. They will want to understand how and by whom." He paused. "And they will come back to the last person who carried it." Claire felt a slow cold settle behind her ribs. She uncrossed and recrossed her arms. "This is not what I agreed to when I kissed a stranger at a jazz bar," she said. Antani Malloy looked at her across her own kitchen, in her own apartment, surrounded by her watercolors and her sketchbooks, and the life she had built in careful, moderate layers. "I know," he said. She could not tell if he meant it as an apology or simply as an acknowledgement of fact. She suspected it was the latter. She suspected that was the most honest thing he had said to her yet. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the window. She looked at him. The question she could not ask out loud was whether she was safer inside this situation or outside of it, and she already knew she was not equipped to answer that alone. She picked up her sketchbook. It was not agreement. It was the thing she did when she had to think and couldn't afford to stop moving. Antani watched her. His eyes tracked the sketchbook with that slight shift she was learning to read as the only visible sign that something had registered. "Where are we going?" she said. Somewhere the envelope can be handled properly, he said, and somewhere no one will look for you while we figure out how far this goes. She looked at him one more time. The platinum hair, and the ice blue eyes, and the suit that had no wrinkles, and the hands that were still and deliberate and ringless today, and the scar on his cheek that nobody got by accident. You think I'm innocent? She said. He said, I think the evidence suggests you are. She said, that's not the same thing. His jaw moved. No, he said. It isn't. She picked up her bag, feeling the wrongness of where the envelope had been even now that it was on the table. She thought about her students. She thought about Renata's 4-second silence. She thought about the look on his face in the bar when she had kissed him, and he had said, you made a mistake. And she thought he had known even then that the night was not finished. I need to leave a note for my neighbor, she said, in case my cat needs feeding. He nodded. She wrote the note. She did not write, I might not be back. She wrote, away for a few days. Could you check on Biscuit? She slid it under Mrs. Ferraro's door on the way out. In the elevator, going down, Antoni Malloy stood at a precise distance from her, close enough that she could feel the gravity of him, and far enough that it was a choice. He was looking at the elevator doors. She was looking at the floor numbers decreasing. She said, when you know I didn't do it on purpose, will you say so? He was quiet for a second. Yes, he said. She filed that away too. The lobby door opened to a gray Chicago morning. A black car waited at the curb. Claire Weston, who had planned to grade watercolor assignments, got in. The car moved through Chicago traffic with the smoothness of a vehicle maintained to silence. Claire sat on the passenger side, and Tawny sat in the middle of the rear seat, where he could see both windows without turning his head. The driver was the gray-suited man from her doorstep. He did not introduce himself. The city outside the tinted windows looked entirely ordinary, which felt like an insult. People walked dogs. A woman pushed a stroller. A delivery driver argued cheerfully on his phone. Claire watched it all with the fixed attention of someone memorizing the last known coordinates of their normal life. The envelope was in a sealed evidence bag now. One of Antoni's men had handled it at the apartment with deliberate care, gloved, methodical. She had watched him work. She hadn't asked what would be done with it. She understood that question would be answered when it was time and not before. Antoni had not spoken since the elevator. He watched his phone with focused attention. She looked out the window instead. She thought about her classroom. She thought about Maya's comment. Your color instinct is excellent. Your confidence needs to match it. She thought, that applies to me right now. Do you live in the city? She said. He looked up. Yes, he said. She waited to see if he would add anything. He did not. Why did you come yourself? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted to see if I'd read you wrong, he said. And had you? She said. His eyes held hers. I'm deciding, he said. She said, that's honest. Something moved at the corner of his mouth again. That not quite a smile she was beginning to recognize as the closest version he kept available during working hours. The car slowed and turned into a private parking structure on the near north side. She followed him into an elevator that required a key card and opened on a floor with no signs and no numbers. She followed him into a room she hadn't expected. She had expected something cold, functional, something that looked like decisions had been made there and none of them good. Instead, it was a quiet office with built-in bookshelves, actual books worn and marked with use, a large desk clean except for a laptop and a lamp, chairs that were comfortable rather than imposing, a window overlooking a bare rooftop garden. She stood in the doorway taking it in. Sit, he said, not unkindly. She sat. He remained standing, one hand on the back of his own chair, looking at the covered envelope on the corner of the desk, the same way she had looked at it in her kitchen. From too far away. You have not asked me what I do, he said. I know what you do, she said. Generally, Renata told me some things before I got in the car. He nodded once. And you still came. She looked at him. I came because the alternative was waiting alone for people I can't answer. He sat across from her now, elbows on the desk, hands loosely clasped. The people who placed this in your bag, he said, knew you would be at the Meridian last night. Which means they knew Renata would invite me, she said. He nodded. We don't think she's involved. We think she was chosen because she knew you. Because you are ordinary in the specific ways that make you useful. She felt the word ordinary land and understood what he meant. Someone had chosen her because she was invisible to people like him. A quiet art teacher with no connections would walk through his world without triggering any of the alarm systems he had spent years building. She had been a door no one would think to guard. So someone inside your organization, she said. His jaw tightened slightly. Or someone with access to my schedule, he said. That's not necessarily the same thing. She nodded. She understood the distinction and its weight. Then she said, What happens to me while you find out? He met her eyes directly. You stay here, he said, until we know the outside is clear. She said, For how long? I don't know yet, he said. She said, If I ask a question, will you answer it? He said, If I can. She said, That's not the same as yes. The edge of his mouth again. No, he said, but it's what I can offer. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she opened her sketchbook. He watched the motion. She didn't draw anything yet. She just held the pencil, its weight in her hand. The particular grounding of something familiar in an entirely unfamiliar room. He stood and moved to the window, speaking quietly into his phone. She looked at the bare garden outside. She thought about her ungraded papers and her cat, and the entire architecture of her ordinary life sitting 11 blocks away, intact and unreachable. Then she began to draw from memory. The bar, the amber light, the empty stool. The shape of a man who had not laughed and not flinched, and had asked one question that now felt like the beginning of everything. Who sent you? Nobody had. That was the part he was starting, slowly, to believe. And somewhere in that building, in a room she hadn't been shown, a sealed envelope was about to reveal not just a secret, but a betrayal so close to Antoni Malloy that when it surfaced it would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, about trust, and about the woman sitting in his office drawing from memory with a pencil held like a lifeline. The envelope opened at 11:43 in the morning. Claire knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on the far wall of Antoni's office. Not from impatience, but from the particular coping mechanism she had developed in graduate school during critiques. If you track small, concrete things, your mind doesn't have room to spiral. The man who opened it wore gloves and used a letter opener with the precision of someone who had been asked to preserve things intact before. He extracted 3 folded pages and 1 photograph. He set them on the desk without comment and stepped back. Antoni stood on the other side of the desk. He looked at the pages. He did not touch them. He looked at the photograph. Something happened to his face in that moment that Claire, watching from the chair where she had been sitting for 2 hours with her sketchbook and a cup of coffee someone had brought her without being asked, recognized immediately. She had seen it in her classroom on the faces of students who opened a graded assignment and found a mark they hadn't expected. Not anger. Something before anger. The specific expression of a person whose internal model of the world has just been revised without their consent. He picked up the photograph. He held it in one gloved hand and looked at it for a long time. Then he set it down face up on the desk and turned to the man who had opened the envelope. "Get me Reeves," he said. His voice was exactly the same temperature it always was. The man left. Claire looked at the photograph from across the desk. It was taken from a distance, a long lens, the kind of image produced by surveillance. 2 men in conversation outside a building she didn't recognize. One of them was Antoni, though younger, the scar absent, the hair slightly darker. The other man was broad and silver-haired, 60s, wearing a dark coat, his hand on Antoni's shoulder in a gesture that read as paternal. On the back of the photograph, in a hand she couldn't identify, someone had written 4 words. He knew from the beginning. Claire looked up at Antoni. He was reading the 3 pages now. He read them once, then went back to the 2nd page and read it again. His hands were completely steady. His breathing was controlled. There was no exterior sign of what was happening inside him except for one, the slight, almost imperceptible whitening of his knuckles around the edges of the paper. She said nothing. She understood without being told that this was not a moment for words. She picked up her pencil and went back to her sketchbook, not drawing anything, just holding it, giving him the courtesy of not being watched while he processed something that was clearly shattering him in a manner he had chosen not to display. When he finally set the pages down and turned away from the desk to face the window, she spoke. "Do you want me to leave the room?" she said. "No," he said. She said, "Okay." She waited. He stood at the window for 3 minutes by the clock. Then he turned around. His face was composed. It was the most unsettling thing she had seen since the bar last night, that perfect, deliberate composure over whatever was underneath it. "The man who organized this," he said, "has been in my organization for 19 years. Claire's throat tightened. She said, "That's who is in the photograph." His jaw moved. "The man with his hand on my shoulder," he said, "is the person who recruited me when I was 22 years old." She looked at him. She said nothing, because nothing she could have said would have been adequate. He sat in his chair again. He looked at the pages. "The envelope was sent by him," he said, "to me. Using you as a carrier, because he knew that if it came directly from him, I would have been prepared for the content. He wanted me unprepared." Claire said, "Why would he want you to see this now?" Antoni looked at her. "Because I've been moving away from certain operations," he said, "for the past 18 months. Quietly, methodically. He's been aware of it. She absorbed that. He's trying to destabilize you before you finish," she said. Antoni looked at her with a quality of attention she had not seen from him yet. Not assessing. Something closer to surprised. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." She said, "What's in the pages?" His eyes held hers for a long moment. "Evidence that he has been siphoning revenue from my organization for 11 years, he said, and framing the documentation in a way that would make it appear I authorized it." She felt the weight of that settle. "So if those pages went to the wrong people," he said, "it ends everything I've built, and me with it." She said, "So he wanted you to open that envelope in a moment of crisis, when you'd be most likely to react." Antoni said, "Yes. And he chose you to deliver it because he assumed I would suspect you immediately, interrogate you, and create a scene that would be witnessed." Claire felt cold. "He used me to destabilize you twice over," she said. "The envelope, and the accusation." Antoni said quietly, "You understood that faster than I expected." She said, "I teach 13-year-olds. Social manipulation is most of the job." The edge of his mouth moved. Then the door opened, and a man came in that Claire had not seen before. He was perhaps 50, lean, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now weathered to something more interesting. He stopped when he saw Claire. His name, she would learn later, was Daniel Reeves, and he had been Antoni's second for 7 years. Antoni told him what the envelope contained in 4 short sentences. Reeves's expression didn't change. He looked at the pages, the photograph, the 4 words on the back. Then he looked at Antoni. "His name," Antoni said. "I want him in the building by end of day." Reeves nodded. He looked at Claire briefly, not unkindly, and left. Antoni leaned back in his chair. He said, "You should eat something." It wasn't what she expected him to say. She looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. He said, "You've been awake since before 8, and it is almost noon." He reached for the desk phone without breaking eye contact with her and said 2 words into it. Someone brought sandwiches 11 minutes later. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She noted that. She noted a great many things in the hours that followed, adding them to the growing document she was assembling in her head. The kind of document she made about new students in the first weeks of school. What they did when they were thinking. What they did when they were controlling something. What they did when they forgot, for a moment, to be performing. Antani Malloy, she was learning, forgot to perform less often than anyone she had ever met. But he had his moments. When she asked him what the man's name was, the one in the photograph, and he answered without his usual pause, she understood the name had mass for him. Victor Crane. She did not ask how long they had known each other. She could count. 19 years. He had been 22. She could do the arithmetic of what that meant. She did not make him say it. She stayed in the office because she had nowhere else to go, and because she didn't fully want to leave. She drew. Not the bar this time. She drew the rooftop garden from memory, the bare branch things in their containers, the way November light fell flat across them. She drew the quality of Antani's face at the window when his world had shifted, and he had decided not to let it show. She thought about what it meant to watch someone closely enough to know their patterns, their schedule, their vulnerabilities, and then to use that knowledge not to protect them, but to destroy them. She thought about motive. Everything was motive. She had a student who once painted the same apple 12 times to understand it. She thought, Victor Crane had spent 19 years studying Antani and understood nothing essential about him. Or perhaps he understood everything and still chose this. She couldn't decide which was worse. The day moved. Men came and went. The tide of it had a rhythm she couldn't fully trace but could feel, the systematic closing of things. At 5 in the afternoon, Antani said, "He's here." His voice had changed by 1 degree, more final. She looked up. He was already standing. He straightened his jacket. He looked at her. "I need you to stay in this room," he said. She said, "Okay." He looked at her for a moment. She had the sense he was deciding something. He said, "Whatever you hear, stay in this room." She met his eyes. She said, "Antani." He paused. She said, "I'm not going to fall apart." His gaze held hers, and for the first time since the bar the previous night, she saw something behind the control that wasn't measurement. It was recognition. The specific kind that happens when a person sees themselves in someone else and is not prepared for it. He left the room. She stayed. She held her sketchbook. She did not draw. She listened to the building. She heard nothing, which was worse than sounds would have been. The silence of a building that had absorbed difficult conversations before and knew how to hold them. Claire sat with her pencil still between her fingers and thought about things that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. She thought about the envelope that had traveled inside her bag like a secret she'd been carrying without consent. She thought about the dare, which now felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different city, at a different point in the movement of time. She thought about Renata, who had called twice in the afternoon and whom she had texted back, "I'm fine, I'll explain later. Please don't worry." The door opened at 7:18. Antani came back in alone. He moved to the window again. His jacket was still perfect. His hands were behind his back. She looked at the profile of him in the last thin light of the November evening and said nothing, because she had learned in 7 hours that the spaces he left were deliberate and that filling them prematurely was a mistake. He stood at the window for 2 minutes. Then he turned. He came and sat not in his chair behind the desk, but in the chair across from her. the second chair that sat beside hers, so that they were at the same level with no desk between them. She looked at him. He said, "Victor has been building a case against me for 3 years. She absorbed that." He said, "The evidence in those pages was real. Everything I did. Every decision that fell outside the boundaries of what could be defended. He documented it all." She said, "And then?" His jaw was tight. He said, "And then he tried to use me to deliver it to myself in a way that would look like I was confessing." She said, "Why would he do that now?" Antoni said, "Because I'm stepping back." His voice was quiet and without inflection. "Because I've been systematically removing myself from the operations that built my power. And when I step all the way back, he steps forward, into what I leave behind." She said, "He was waiting for you to vacate the position." Antoni nodded. "He wanted me gone," she said slowly, "but he wanted me gone without a fight. He wanted the evidence to force me out quietly." Antoni looked at her. "Yes," she said. "And instead, the envelope ended up with you." Antoni said, "Because you don't know how to disappear into the background of a room." She blinked. He said, "He chose you because he assumed you'd be nervous, that you'd stay at the edge of things and hand the envelope to one of my men who would process it and bring it to me without looking too closely at how it arrived." He paused. "Instead, you kissed me." She stared at him. "It derailed his timing," she said. He said, "Entirely." She felt something that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. She said, "The dare." He said, "Saved me approximately 3 years of legal exposure." She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Then she said, "What happened with Victor tonight?" Antoni looked at the window. "Victor is no longer a concern," he said. She did not ask what that meant. She understood the grammar of it well enough. She said, "Is it over?" He said, "For Victor, yes. For the structural problem he created, no. There will be a period of reorganization." He looked at her. His eyes were tired in a way she hadn't seen before, a tiredness that lived below the surface of his control rather than in his expression. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. He said, "I suspected you of being complicit for the first 4 hours." She said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong." She said, "You were right to be careful." He looked at her with that quality of attention again, the one she had first noticed at the bar. He said, "You're not angry." She said, "I was briefly." She paused. "But I understand that you live in a world where trusting quickly has consequences." He said, "It does." She said, "I just don't live in that world." He said quietly, "No, you don't." The distinction between them opened in the room and they both looked at it. She said, "Will you be able to finish what you started, stepping back?" He said, "The timeline is complicated now." She said, "But possible." He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She said, "Good." He said, "Why does that matter to you?" She looked at him directly. "Because you decided to do it before you met me," she said. "That means it was real." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Most people in my life assume I'm incapable of wanting something different." She said, "Most people in your life have a stake in what you remain." He went very still. She said, "That's not a judgment." He said, "I know." He looked at his hands. She looked at hers. She said, "What happens to me now?" He said, "You can go home. The immediate threat has been neutralized." She felt relief, and something else that she chose not to examine closely. She said, "And after tonight?" He said, "That depends on you." She looked at him. He met her eyes. He said, "I'd like to see you again." She said, "Under better circumstances." He said, "Significantly better." She said, "No envelopes." He said, "No envelopes." She picked up her sketchbook and her bag. She stood. He stood. He was close enough that the gravity of him was entirely present. She said, "I never asked whether you liked the kiss." She said it lightly, returning to the bar, to the dare, to the moment before everything had weight. He looked at her for a long beat. He said, "I've been thinking about it since you walked away." She said, "At the bar you looked like I'd done something criminal." He said, "You'd introduced a variable I wasn't prepared for. That's the closest thing to criminal in my world." She smiled. He almost smiled back. She said, "Good night, Antony Malloy." He said, "Good night, Claire Weston." She walked out. In the hallway, the gray-suited man waited to take her home. She thought about rooftop gardens in winter. She thought about the sketch she had made of his face from memory. She thought about a man deciding to want something different and what it cost him. She thought, "This isn't finished." And she was right. It wasn't finished. But she could not have known, going home in the black car through Chicago at night, that the part not yet finished would not end the way either of them had imagined it. 3 weeks passed. They were the quietest 3 weeks of Claire's recent life, and the most complicated simultaneously, which is a condition she recognized from certain periods of making art. The ones where the surface of things is controlled and the interior is doing something you can't fully see yet. Antony texted in the mornings. Not always. Not on a schedule. Just occasionally, the way a person does when they think of something and decide to say it, rather than let it pass. He texted things like, "The rooftop garden has something growing." She texted back, "In November?" He texted, "I've been told it's an herb of some kind." She texted, "You live there and you don't know what's in your own garden." He texted, "I've been busy." She texted, "I'll believe that." They had dinner twice. Once at a place he chose, quiet, and off the kind of street that didn't appear on casual maps. Once at a place she chose, a neighborhood Italian restaurant with checkered tablecloths and a waiter who called everyone boss with cheerful impartiality, which made Antony's expression do something she was coming to love, that particular suppression of amusement over the not smile, like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to find things funny. They talked about ordinary things and irregular things in the same register, the way two people do when they are establishing the specific vocabulary of each other. She told him about a student who had spent 3 weeks painting the same apple from 12 different angles. He said, "Why the apple?" She said, "She told me she wanted to understand it completely before she let it be anything else." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's very disciplined for 12. She said, "She's 13. He said, "Still." They didn't talk about Victor Crane. They didn't talk about the envelope or the betrayal, or the 19 years of something now burned entirely to the ground. They didn't need to. She understood that the silence around it was not avoidance but digestion, the long work of absorbing something that had rearranged the internal architecture of his life and required time before it could be spoken about cleanly. She was patient. She had learned patience from watercolors, which punished impatience without exception. What she didn't know, in those 3 weeks of quiet mornings and careful dinners, was that the reorganization Antony had described as a structural problem had a shape she couldn't see from where she stood. She didn't know that Victor Crane, before his removal from the situation, had put something in motion that could not be recalled once started. She didn't know that the 3 pages in the envelope had been photographed before they reached Antony's desk, and that those photographs had gone to a man in Philadelphia named Gerald Marsh, who had his own interests in what Antony Malloy left behind. She didn't know that Reeves, Antony's second, had been trying to find Gerald Marsh for 11 days, and that Marsh was very good at not being found. She didn't know any of this because Antony didn't tell her, not out of deception, but out of the specific protection she had named herself that first evening in his office. He did not want her to be a target. He had been managing this in parallel to the dinners and the morning texts, and the rooftop herb he still couldn't identify. He had been doing what he had always done, holding the weight of his world at a distance from the things he was trying to keep separate from it. He was very good at it. He had been good at it for 12 years. The 22nd day after the bar, Claire was walking back from school. It was a Tuesday in early December, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes Chicago feel like a different city, narrower and sharper, and less tolerant of things being left unfinished. She had a tote bag of student work to review and her sketchbook and her phone, on which Antoni had texted that morning. "Dinner this week if you're free." She had texted back, "Thursday." He had texted back, "Thursday." She was thinking about Thursday. She was thinking about the student who painted apples, and how to encourage her towards something new, without dishonoring the discipline. She was thinking about whether to bring her sketchbook to dinner, or whether that was too comfortable too fast. Whether comfortable too fast was a thing that mattered at her age, whether her age was a thing she needed to think about, when a car pulled to the curb alongside her. Not Antoni's car, not the gray-suited man. A different car, newer, rented-looking. The window came down. The man inside was someone she had never seen. He said her name. He said, "Miss Weston, I need you to get in." She stopped walking. She said, "I don't know you." He said, "You know Antoni Malloy." He said it in the way of a person who is using a name as a key. She said, "I'm going to keep walking." She did. He said through the window, "He's been shot." She stopped. Her bag hit the sidewalk. She turned around. She looked at the man in the car. His face was neutral in the particular way of someone delivering information that is true, and that they have been instructed to deliver and nothing more. She said, "Where?" He said, "St. Michael's on Dearborn." He said, "He asked for you." She stood on the sidewalk, with the cold air moving past her and the student paintings in her bag and her phone in her coat pocket with Thursday on the screen, and she understood in that moment the specific nature of what she had been walking into for 3 weeks. Not gradually, not metaphorically. In one absolute second of clarity, the way light falls on a subject at a particular angle, and you finally see its actual dimensions. She picked up her bag. She said, "Drive." The hospital smelled like every hospital, disinfectant and recycled air, and the particular institutional attempt to make fluorescent light bearable that never succeeded. She was brought through a side entrance, not the emergency room, a private corridor. Reeves was there. He looked like someone who had spent the last 3 hours making decisions quickly and paying for each of them. He said, "He's in surgery." She said, "What happened?" He said, "We found Gerald Marsh." He paused. "Gerald Marsh also found us first." She said, "Is he?" Reeves said, "Marsh is not a concern anymore." She stood in the corridor and felt the words move through her without landing anywhere solid. She said, "How bad is it?" Reeves said, "The surgeons said manageable." She said, "Manageable meaning?" He said, "He'll survive." She let out a breath that had been held. She realized, since the sidewalk, since the man in the car had said his name and shot in the same sentence. She said, "Can I see him?" Reeves said, "When he's out." She sat in a chair in a private waiting room and held her sketchbook in her lap and did not draw. She thought about Thursday. She thought about what a word like manageable meant when used in reference to a person. She thought about the rooftop garden, and the herb that was growing in December, and the way he had said your color instinct is excellent. Your confidence needs to match it when she'd told him about Maya, and she had thought, how does he know what to say to that? She had thought, because he knows what it is to be competent in a world that underestimates you. She sat there for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Then Reeves came back and said, "He's asking for you." He was in a private room. The lights were low. He was upright enough that she understood manageable was being honored, though the effort of it was visible in the set of his jaw. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. She said, "You got shot." He said, "It's been a complicated month." She pulled the chair close and sat. She said, "You didn't tell me about Marsh." He said, "I was handling it." She said, clearly. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I wanted to keep you out of it." She said, "I know." She said, "I understand why." He said, "But," she said, "but you were handling it alone when you didn't have to be." He was quiet. She said, "I'm not angry." He said, "You look angry." She said, "I'm not angry. I'm thinking." He waited. She said, "When you said you were stepping back from certain things, did you mean all the way or just some of the way?" He looked at her. His eyes were the same ice blue they had been in the bar, unchanged by the hospital room or the low light or the 3 hours of surgery. He said, "I meant all the way." She said, "How much is left?" He said, "One more piece." She said, "Marsh was the last of it." He said, "Yes." She held his gaze. She said, "And now?" He said quietly, "Now it's done." She sat with that. The machines made their small sounds. Outside the room, she could hear the corridor and the distant ordinary business of a hospital doing what hospitals do. She said, "I want you to tell me when things are happening." He said, "Claire." She said, "I'm not asking to be involved. I'm asking not to be kept outside the glass." He was silent for a moment. He said, "It's a habit." She said, "I know. Break it." His mouth moved. Not the knot smile. Closer this time. He said, "You're the only person who talks to me like that." She said, "Like what?" He said, "Like I'm a person who can be wrong." She looked at him. She said, "You are a person who can be wrong." She paused. "You were wrong tonight." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the night before, possibly, and several other times I don't know about." He said, almost certainly. She said, "That's fine. I'm wrong routinely, and I teach art to children for a living." He said, "Those two things are not related." She said, "They are absolutely related." He looked at her for a long time. His breathing was controlled. His hands were still. She reached out and put her hand over his on the blanket. Not dramatically, just there, the weight of it. He looked at her hand. He turned his palm up and held it. She said, "I made a stupid dare 3 weeks ago and kissed a man who was going to turn my entire understanding of the shape of my life upside down." He said, "I didn't intend that." She said, "I know. That's why it worked." He said, "I have a complicated life." She said, "You have a life that is becoming less complicated, incrementally." He said, "It may always be somewhat complicated." She said, "I teach middle school art. Complicated is a setting I'm familiar with." He looked at her. That quality of attention again, the one that felt like being seen in dimensions rather than surfaces. He said, "What I want is more Thursday dinners." She said, "That's very specific." He said, "I want more time." She said, "We have time." He said, "I don't know how to promise normal." She said, "I haven't asked you to." She held his hand. The room was quiet. She thought about the photograph, the 4 words on the back. He knew from the beginning. She thought about what it meant to be betrayed by something that old, something foundational, something that predated almost everything you had built. She thought, that kind of wound doesn't close quickly. She thought, that's fine, I'm patient. I learned patience from watercolors. She thought, he built an empire on the premise that loyalty was purchasable and that fear was a sustainable currency. He had been wrong about both. She thought, I know nothing about that world, and yet I understand it completely from the inside out. Because I have stood in front of rooms full of people who would rather perform than be honest, and the ones who survive are not the ones who perform best. They are the ones who eventually stop. She thought, he is stopping. Slower than he would like, with more damage than he planned for, but stopping. She was still thinking about that when the light in the room shifted by the small degree, that means the night has moved into its deepest hours, and the city outside has gone quiet in the way it only does between 2 and 4 in the morning. Antani's breathing had evened out. She thought he was asleep. She was looking at the window when he said, very quietly, "Claire." She turned. His eyes were open. He said, "Stay." She looked at him. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." He said, "I mean in general." She understood what he meant. She understood the weight it cost him to say it. This man who had spent 12 years not asking for anything he couldn't guarantee he could protect. She felt the full depth of it. She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I can't promise you simple." She said, "You've said that before." He said, "I want to say it correctly." She looked at him. She said, "Antani." He said, "Yes." She said, "I kissed you on a dare, and then spent a night in your building, and watched you find out that someone you trusted for 19 years had been working against you, and I sat in a hospital waiting room for 2 hours, and I'm still here." He was quiet. She said, "The simple ship has sailed." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not grieving it." His hand tightened around hers by 1 degree. He said, "I'm going to be okay." She said, "I know you are." He said, "I mean all of it." She looked at him. She said, "I believe you." Then she looked at the window, and there was a long silence that was not empty. A silence with dimension and temperature, and the particular substance of something that has been decided and doesn't need to be said again. She thought, this is the beginning of something. She had thought that before, in the bar, in her kitchen, in the elevator going down, on the sidewalk in the cold when she picked up her bag. But this time it settled differently, not with the thrill of a dare or the edge of uncertainty, with the specific quiet weight of a choice made after everything else had been considered, and the answer was still yes. She thought, I teach art. I understand that the interesting work starts after the initial impulse. The dare gets you to the canvas. What you make of it after that is the actual painting. Antani Malloy had 19 years of his life scorched behind him, and an uncertain road in front of him, and a hand that held hers with the deliberate care of a man learning, finally, to want something he hadn't budgeted for. She had a cat named Biscuit, and a sketchbook, and a student who painted the same apple 12 times to understand it. She thought, that's enough to begin with. She held his hand. She watched the window. The night continued its slow business around them. And in the corridor outside, Reeves stood with his back against the wall and looked at his phone and did not go home, because there were still details to close and a world to reorganize and things that needed managing. He thought, he's going to be all right. He thought, she's going to stay. He thought about all of it, the bar, the envelope, the 19 years, the photograph on the desk, the 4 words on the back. He had been with Antani long enough to know that the moments that changed a man's life rarely announced themselves clearly. Usually they looked like something small. A dare, a kiss, a sealed envelope with a stranger's fingerprints on it and no return address. He thought, that's how it starts. He put his phone away. He stood in the corridor of a hospital in Chicago in December and let the night do what nights do. Inside the room, the woman who had kissed a stranger on a dare kept her hand in his, and the man who had spent 12 years controlling everything let her. Outside, the city moved on in its unremarkable way, indifferent and continuous, carrying its ordinary people through their ordinary hours, none of them knowing that in a room on the 4th floor of St. Michael's on Dearborn, something had quietly, irreversibly shifted, the way light shifts at dawn before you notice, the way a painting changes when you add the last layer, and suddenly everything that came before it becomes necessary. Antani Malloy did not die that December night. but the version of him who had walked into the Meridian alone, and untethered, and armored against everything including himself, did. He died in that hospital room with a woman's hand in his, and a rooftop garden he couldn't name growing somewhere above his city in the dark. That version of him was gone. What grew in its place was quieter, more carefully tended, less defended, more alive. And Claire Weston, who had come to the bar because a friend had texted at 6:30, and because she was helplessly curious, and because she had one particular flaw she had never fully managed to correct, went home the next morning on the subway like any other Tuesday, with her sketchbook and her tote bag of student paintings, and sat in her classroom before the students arrived and opened to a blank page. She drew the hospital room from memory, the low light, the window, the shape of a man who had let someone stay. She held the pencil still for a moment, looking at the drawing. Then she wrote underneath it, in the careful looping hand she used for student comments. The interesting work starts after the initial impulse. She looked at it. She thought, yes. She closed the sketchbook. The students arrived. She put the watercolors out. The day began.